Okay, fine. I'll tell you the story. So about 2 years ago, I was looking for an amp, but I wasn't just looking for any amp. I wanted like a serious upgrade. You see, at the time I had just started making videos and I thought it would be a cool idea as something to document, as well as having an amp to just like mic up. Pretty much I just thought it would be a really cool adventure. At the very least, I would be a leprechaun, and at the end of my rainbow would probably be a new amp. So with that at the front of my mind, I started doing research. I pulled out my laptop to look at all of the used listings to just kind of get a feel for what was out there, what the prices were like, and eventually, as does happen, I started to find a few sort of viable options as to what I could actually buy. But I wanted to make for absolute certain, so I decided to ask one of my buddies in the professional studio world, like, for the price I'm looking for, what could I actually get? Now, my buddy has about the craziest amp collection you've ever seen, from Fenders to Supros to Revs, you name it, he has it. So I decided to tell him that I was in the market for getting a new amp, and he goes, Mike, I have the exact one that you need to get. You need to get the Vox AC30 with the top boost.
With the top boost.
With the top boost. Now, I had owned Vox amps before. My first real one that I owned was a Vox VT20 Valvetronics, for the real ones that know. And I had also owned a 15-watt Night Train combo that I actually sold earlier that year. But this felt like a big boy move where I was stepping into like the real world of Vox style amps. But there was just this one problem. The AC30, it's very big and very high wattage. And even though I was looking for like a very good tube amp, the fact that I was in a small apartment, it wasn't going to change for a very long time. So I decided that I would go with the AC15 C1. The C1 actually stands for, well, Celestian. And at the time I didn't really know what that meant, but more on the speakers in just a minute. You see, I ended up finding this used one online, and I was so excited because it was in my price range, and I was going to meet the guy who was selling it to me on my way to this New Year's party that my drummer was having. I ended up meeting this guy in the middle of this Starbucks parking lot, and he was so nice. He was so welcoming. He let me film for a while. We ended up talking gear, but eventually we just went our separate ways. So after the party, I took this thing home, and I was immediately so excited to see what like this legendary Vox tone was all about in person. I wanted to mic it up. I wanted to hear it back in real time, and let me tell you firsthand, it did not disappoint. Glassy cleans with the top boost were so unique and so different from all of like the Fender style amps and even some of the Vox style amps that I had owned before. And I started to become a bit unrealistically optimistic about how much I would actually use this amp in the future. I was like, I'm gonna use this thing on like a daily basis. I mean, I'm gonna use this thing so much in the comments, they're gonna start calling me Mr. Vox, the Vox shill, the Vox whatever. But as time began to move and pass and go on, I began to notice something. That didn't really happen. Not only did I not play the Vox as much as I anticipated, but I stopped playing it pretty much altogether entirely. I mean, outside of a handful of videos, and I'm talking less than 5, where I specifically needed to tone match to the style of an AC15, it really never left the corner of my room. So I just assumed that it would forever be stuck in the corner of my room. Well, that was until one night in particular. You see, a couple of weeks ago, right before I moved, my 2 best friends from church, they came up to me and they were like, hey Mike, how would you feel about seeing The Fray with us? Now, The Fray is my favorite band of all time. I was like, absolutely 100%. You just tell me where to be and when. So I'm at this concert and I'm having the time of my life. I'm literally like 20, 25 feet away from some of the musicians that literally changed the way that I listen to music. And all of a sudden, because I'm a gearhead and I like looking at this thing, I'm not just paying attention to the vocals or the guitars, but I start looking at the gear. And in the middle of screaming my lungs out like lost and insecure, I see out of the corner of my eye the guitar player, Dave Welsh. Well, he's using a Vox AC30. And begins to plant this sort of seed in my head, like, oh man, that's a really cool Vox AC30. I wonder what it would be like to play through that or to see how he got some of those sounds, because they were absolutely filthy. So I go home and I sort of forget about it because I had a few more pressing matters at the time. I had to make sure the studio was like done and I could start making videos again. I have to decide which guitars are going where, which amps are going to go where. So I start dragging everything up the stairs, and of course in the corner of my eye, I see the Vox AC15 C1, and I'm like deciding once again where I'm gonna put it. And of course I relegate it, just like it was in the old apartment, to the very corner of my room, probably designated to never be touched or played again. Well, that was until a couple nights ago. You see, I had some time on my hands the other day while I was taking a break from a different project that I was working on. More on that later. I was trying out all my different amps at high volumes for the first time, trying to see what they can really do and what they would sound like through different mics. And wouldn't you know, that seed that was planted in my head by The Fray finally made its way to the front of my cortex, because I was like, oh, let me actually take out the Vox AC15 for the first time in a while. Ladies and gentlemen, I started to really sort through some of these tones, really get the feel for what this amp was all about for the first time in a while. And I think what I discovered was really cool. There were actually about 4 things. So let me show you what I found out. Now, a big thing when it comes to the Vox sound that people look for actually has a lot to do with the specific choice of input. Like we were talking about before, the thing that my friend wanted to make sure that I got right was the top boost. Now, I had owned a couple different Vox amps over the years, most notably my Night Train 15-watt combo, but that amp actually is very different from something like this right here, or even a lot of the AC30s in their original design. The biggest difference being something like this, 2 channels, 2 inputs, and most of the Voxes that I had played before, 1 channel, 1 input. But what even is a top boost? Well, I'll tell you right now, it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's a different circuit that gives you a gain boost, particularly in the high ends, kind of like a treble boost. And that's where you start to get a lot of the more signature Vox sounds, especially when we start to talk about like the broken up tones. Now, the channel input isn't the only big thing when it comes to getting more iconic Vox sounds. One of the biggest difference makers, not just in Voxes, but in any amp, is the actual choice of speaker. Now, originally, I never really cared about the specific speaker. It was really about what was right here, what was the name on the amp. But the more I actually got into playing modelers that had different speakers and different IR cabs, I got to see just how much variation there actually was, even when you were playing the exact same amp. That rang even more true once I started playing my different tube amps through something like an aux box, and I was floored with just how much variety there actually was. Now, if we're going to zoom in again to this Vox right here, this AC15C1 specifically has a greenback speaker as opposed to an Alnico blue, which is usually a bit more expensive and known for having a little bit more of a sparkly high end, as well as a difference in like speaker sensitivity. Now, the other thing that really got me once I started pulling this amp out again was the actual reverb. And I think that's because more recently I've pretty much found myself in 2 different camps. The first of which is with my amps like the Vibro Champ that happen to have a hall reverb, or I'll be using an alternate pedal. I'm not using a lot of amps like this for their internal reverb, but I forget a lot of the times that it's not a hall, it's a spring, and it's completely different from a lot of the halls and the plates that I've been using. Now that I think brings up a very different point, because for people like me, especially like a lot of really ambient players, using in-amp reverb isn't something that I necessarily want to do all the time. But it is interesting to remind myself of a spring, even if this isn't my favorite reverb that I've ever used on a specific amp. Now, the last thing I felt like I really wanted to explore when I pulled out this amp was actually the way that it took pedals, specifically when it came to using the top boost with something like an overdrive or a boost or even a distortion. My reason for that being, with the top boost being more of a trebly lead thing and knowing a little bit more about this circuit than I used to, once I started pulling out the DS1, even when I pulled the tone down more and more, I was like, okay, that's still a little bit too trebly for what I usually like, even if I'm trying to get more of a Vox style sound. And that's where the tone cut actually really started to make sense to me, because of just how sensitive and just how cool it was. Because I could go from something like this with the tone all the way down, then all I'd have to do is pull the tone cut maybe even halfway up. So the tone cut really kind of took this amp to a different level for me, especially once I started to get into the weeds of putting this thing with different pedals. So guys, that right there is the Vox AC15. And I actually do think I learned a lot from using it. The biggest lesson that I took from that being that more recently I've been playing a lot of these darker amps like Supros and even more mid-focus things like the Fender Tweeds. But when I get to something like this, I need to remind myself a lot of the times that you're not trying to make it sound like what you're familiar with. You need to embrace those glassy cleans and see what they're actually supposed to sound like in the context of Voxes. And that's something that trips me up with a lot of different amps because it takes a lot more time with experimentation than with something you're just generally familiar with. I think I really like that because it challenges my ear as a guitar player, because to be completely honest, when I first pulled this thing out after all those months, within the first 15 minutes, I didn't even know if I liked the sound. And this video took a lot longer than most of my other videos because it took me days to figure out how to even record this thing. How to really tame the top boost, what pedals that I actually specifically liked with it, figuring out all of my thoughts. But I don't think it really matters what I think. What matters is what you think. So please let me know. Are you a fan of the Vox AC15? Are you a fan of the Vox sound in general? Let me know in the comments. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video. It was really, really fun to be able to take out the AC15 and really see what it can do for the first time in a long, long time, especially with a lot of stuff that I didn't really show on screen with different guitars and different pedals, where I really got to figure out what this thing was supposed to sound like I said before. But if you want to know anything more about the AC15C1, this video in particular is sponsored by the homies at Sweetwater, and they have many of them. The links are in the description. Make sure to check it out. It's one of the best ways to support the channel if that's something you want to do, or if you're just curious about any of the other gear that I use in this video, like the mics or the pedals, make sure to check out those links. Also, like and subscribe if you had a good time. Also, thank you so much to all of my patrons. There's some extra exclusive stuff on there if you want to check it out and join the community. Like and subscribe if you had a good time. Most importantly, most important of all, have a fantastic day.